Okay, so it's 6:30, so I'm going to get started with our event tonight, Race and Policing in the Age of Black Lives Matter with Professor Duchess Harris. My name is Carrie Jager. I'm a teacher at Hastings High School. I'm also one of the members of the Thrive in Hastings Steering Committee. So thank you for joining us here tonight for this Thrive event. I will introduce Professor Duchess Harris, and then she will take it from there. So Duchess Harris is a professor of American Studies at Macalester College. In fact, she became the first chair of the American Studies Department in 2003. She has a Juris Doctorate and expertise in civil rights law. Many of her courses at Macalester focus on 20th century African American political history and civil rights. The Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers chose Duchess to receive the Profiles and Courage Award in 2015, and she is currently a member of Governor Dayton's Board of Public Defense. Additionally, she's published several academic books, and she has curated over 100 books for students in grades 3 through 12. Welcome, Duchess.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me. Greetings from my home in Badness Heights. And just a tiny correction, I was appointed by Dayton, but now that Walz is governor, I'm still there. So I just wanted to make that clarification. And I'm proud to serve. Tonight, I'm going to talk about a book that I've written for 6th to 12th graders. And I'm going to talk about how the book came about, because it really wasn't something that I was expecting. And then I'm going to kind of talk about like where we are right now in 2020. And then I would love to get some questions. So I will just begin with, here we go. A quote from one of my theorists, favorite theorists, James Baldwin, who writes, "History, I contend, is the present. We, with every breath we take, every move we make, are history. And what goes around comes around." And that's from The Evidence of Things Not Seen. And so one of the things that I think you'll see in this presentation tonight, that sometimes we are surprised by things that are happening in the current moment. But if we look back at history, we realize it's actually the changing same. So the story of this Black Lives Matter book. If my dean were on this call, I would tell her that the thing that I enjoy the most about my job is teaching and research. Why would I say that? Well, she's my boss, she's my dean. But because she's not on this call, I will admit to you all that one of the things I really enjoy about my job is going on sabbatical. So I went on sabbatical for the 2013-2014 academic year. And if anyone's ever had the privilege of being able to have that kind of leave from their job, the only downside is the return. And so in the beginning of August, I started feeling some anxiety, thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm going to be, back in the fire. By August 9th, my anxiety had really escalated, because that is when Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. It was disruptive to my system because the images were everywhere. If you remember, his body was on the ground for 5 hours. And given technology, that made it such that there were opportunities for people around the world to see this image. And it was riveting. It was also riveting outside of how I felt about it personally, connected to my career, because I was going to have to return to teaching 3 weeks later. And because of the subject matter I teach, I realized that we would probably have to address it in the classroom. I had 2 different classes that semester. One was Introduction to African American Studies, which actually starts during the Reconstruction time period. So we really had no reason to talk about current events. The other one, Race and the Law, where I really don't even talk about criminal stuff that much. But students had cell phones, and the event is unfolding as they're standing in the hallway waiting to enter the classroom. So I surveyed students in both of my classes and just asked them, what were your backgrounds in high school? Do you have any experience talking about contemporary US race relations? I emphasize contemporary because, come to find out, almost all the students had a unit on slavery, but none of the students had been given the skill set. to talk about current events, which I would argue is a particular skill set. And so it was a very challenging semester, but we left the semester. I took a nice deep break in the winter and kind of got geared up again for the spring. So when spring rolled around, there's a publishing company in Edina called Abdo, and they are fantastic. They called me and said that there was a woman in St. Louis who had already started a draft of a manuscript of Black Lives Matter. Would I like to be a content consultant? Sounded interesting. What a content consultant is basically a fact checker. You get paid $200 and you basically weigh in as an expert as if the book has merit. I thought that the writing was beautiful. There were two things that I wanted to be different about the book. And one was that I thought the book was ahistoricized. And what I mean by that is that it just kind of had Michael Brown as like the point of departure and didn't connect it to anything that had happened previously in US history. The other thing is that I didn't think it included some of the legal analysis that you might need for a book like this. So I asked the publishing company if they would be willing to consider me a co-author since I'd reworked it so much. Their response was, if you don't want any more money, go for it. And the woman that I wrote the book with, Sue Bradford Edwards, she had no problem either. So once we were done with the manuscript, I contacted then Congressman Keith Ellison, who now, of course, is the Attorney General, asked him to write the introduction. Some people have a critique of the book that it doesn't include Sandra Bland. It's mostly men that are in the book. One of the reasons why Sandra Bland is not in the book is that we had already gone to print before she had been killed. So if you look at my timeline here, it's August and the book is wrapped up, but it hasn't gone to print. And the media relations person at McAllister said, hey, I have an opportunity for you to pitch your book. You can go on TPT Almanac. They gave me 7 minutes, which for somebody who has the level of fame that I do, which is pretty little, that was a huge amount of time. So I was delighted. As you know, Almanac comes on Friday night. I went into my weekend thinking, what could possibly go wrong? That was pretty naive on my part. I shouldn't have thought that. And so in the wee hours early on Monday morning, I realized that Larry Elder had done an entire segment on the book where he said that this book is indoctrinating children to believe that Black people are victims and white people should feel guilty about it. Now, if you are a Larry Elder fan, you'd know he's very charismatic and charming. So when my friend sent me the link to the book, my first reaction was, well, that's just terrible. I had no idea that he was talking about me. And so let me kind of fill in some of the facts that go along with this. Fact number one is that no one had read the book. One of the reasons why no one has read the book is because there are only 3 electronic copies. My co-author Sue has a copy, I have a copy, and then the head editor at Abdo has a copy. That's it. It's August 2015. The book's not supposed to come out until January. So if you know anything about publishing, it's too early for it to have gone to the galleys. Because there ends up being a lot of controversy about the book in Twitterverse. And the controversy is both with the left wing and the right wing. So the right wing says that, this is an atrocity. Who are these people that are putting this information out there? The left wing says, this is the most, brilliant manuscript we've ever read. Both were pretty inaccurate, mostly because no one had read the book. So I could have been flattered by people saying that I was brilliant, but I couldn't really take that in because they hadn't seen it. So here's the jacket cover of the book. And this is from a protest in Baltimore, Maryland, where people were looking for justice for Freddie Gray. And so let's just deal with what the book really does. And so the purpose of the book is not to indoctrinate white school children. So for full disclosure, I live in Badness Heights. If I were indoctrinating white school children, my kids wouldn't have anyone to play with. So that's not what the book is doing. What the book is doing is trying to answer this question: how do we get from Dred Scott to Michael Brown? Okay, and so that's what I'm going to lay out this evening. So if I framed it, because I have taught this class as like one unit at McAllister, I would frame it in these different time periods, but around the themes of hope and despair. So the first time period would be Reconstruction to Brown versus Board of Education. So the hope during this time period, of course, is that emancipation happens, right? Which is, an amazing event that people who've been enslaved have been waiting for more than 200 years. And this is when Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The despair is that Reconstruction is a really hostile time in American history. If you go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., they demonstrate that Reconstruction is the least researched and least taught about time period. It's a time period where you have 58 years of legal segregation. And this is after 246 years of slavery. And so the South isn't interested in being reconstructed. And so they are trying to keep the status quo in place. If we go to teaching the civil rights movement up to the Bill Clinton administration, once again, looking at hope and despair, the hope is that you get some civil rights legislation. So from the federal government, you get a Civil Rights Act in 64. My slide doesn't indicate it, but in 65, you get the Voting Rights Act. 68, you get fair housing. Something that books often don't do is talk about the way that Black people seek to liberate themselves. And so you get a Black feminist movement, which is separate from the mainstream second wave of feminism. There's a movement for Black power, as you can see the image here from the 1968 Olympics. And then there's a Black arts movement, which is basically to, showcase, a different kind of visual aesthetic. The despair, however, is that there's lots of pushback during the Reagan-Bush administrations for the advancements that Black Americans are trying to make in the 60s and the 70s. And so an example of that would be the fact that the word welfare queen or the expression welfare queen did not exist in our lexicon until President Reagan created that phrase. And he created that phrase talking about a woman named Linda Taylor who lived in Chicago, who actually had cheated the government out of $8,000. What Reagan had done on his campaign trail, however, was say that she had cheated the government out of $150,000. And this was to, evoke a kind of resentment to people who were, benefiting from welfare benefits. If we move forward a little bit, there are many people out there that think that President Clinton was really radical, really far left. I've written a book that deals with both of his terms extensively. And when you look at it, he was actually a lot more moderate than what some folks might say. And so this right here is an image from the Associated Press, which went out in all the major newspapers. And this is when people still read newspapers more, right? Because it's 1996. And this is the signing of his welfare to work bill. He has strategically placed African-American women on each side of him as a signal to the nation that he is helping Black people. Once again, statistically, this is inaccurate, and it also breeds resentment for people who think that they're working hard and their tax-paying dollars should not go to Black people who are not working. So then if you move on to this moment of Black Lives Matter in the age of Obama, what you find is that the irony that when you have Reagan as president, Bush as president, Clinton as president, you don't have Black Lives Matter. Somehow, when you get the first Black president of the United States, you get a younger generation of Black people who rise up and resist against Obama. So one of the reasons that younger Black people end up pushing against Obama is because they felt like he did not address race relations enough in his first term. And so academics would say the corny joke that he's caught between Barack and a hard place. There's no way that he can figure out how to be a president who's Black and address race relations in a way that doesn't upset people. So the first time he tries to take this issue on is when the African-American man who is sitting next to Joe Biden, his name is Professor Henry Louis Gates. Henry Louis Gates is on the faculty of Harvard. He traveled globally, at least before COVID, and he was getting back into his home and couldn't find his keys. He was jet lagged and was trying to get inside his house. He lives in an affluent area. He's wealthy. A woman saw him on the porch and called 911 and said that there was a Black man breaking into a home. By the time the police officers got there, he was already on the inside of his house. Now, I don't know how his house is decorated, but I would think that there would be pictures of him in his house, the way there are pictures of me and my family in my house, but somehow he ends up being taken in and detained. Um, this ends up being really controversial because working class Black people are not happy about the fact that President Obama is going to respond to this Black person who is a part of the elite class and has actually been one of his highest donors. There are also white people who were a part of police families who felt like Obama saying that the arresting officer had acted stupidly was disrespectful. And so what Obama tries to do to solve this is to have a beer summit in the Rose Garden. Sadly enough, it satisfies no one. And so it isn't until we get into his second term of presidency that Obama addresses race relations head on over something that is far more controversial than a professor at Harvard, getting into his own house. And that is the issue of Trayvon Martin. So Trayvon Martin is killed in 2012, but we really don't get things moving until between 2012 and 2013 in terms of what's going on with this case. Um, Trayvon Martin is killed by George Zimmerman, who initially is not arrested because he says it's self-defense. If you're familiar with Florida law, you know it's the stand your ground argument, and the police department was satisfied with that. It wasn't until people of a younger generation got on Twitter and circulated a petition for George Zimmerman to be arrested that there was actually a trial. It went to trial. There were 12 women on the jury, and Mr. Zimmerman was acquitted. So there was a big breakdown in the country in terms of how people felt about the acquittal. And so this is when President Obama returns to the Rose Garden where he'd had the beer summit and said, if he'd had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. He goes on to say that the country has a lot of soul searching to do to figure out how something like this would happen. There were people that perceived this to be race baiting. They did not appreciate it. And then once again, younger folks felt like it didn't go far enough. And so, it's very divisive, so much so that the Washington Post indicates that 86% of African Americans were upset by the acquittal, but only 30% of white respondents were upset. When I'm teaching undergrads, I explain to them, this is common, right? If you're old enough to remember Rodney King or like any incidents that have happened throughout the nation, there's usually this kind of divide. So this is what leads to Black Lives Matter. And so what you have are these three young women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who get on Twitter and start talking about how upset they are and create the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Something I have to explain to young people, and if you want to feel your age a little bit, first year college students were born in 2002, is to explain to them that 8 years ago, 5 million tweets in one day was unheard of, right? That happens now. That wasn't happening in 2012. And so this is how the movement starts. It starts as a cyber movement, right? Which is particular to people who are now like 30 somethings, that this is how they communicate in the world. It ends up becoming more of a movement on the ground when 2 years later, Eric Garner is killed in New York City. He says, I can't breathe, well before George Floyd does. And the police officer who ended up being responsible for his death is found not guilty. Lots of protesting in the streets in New York. After that is really when you get a groundswell of support, if we take it back to me getting off a sabbatical and finding out about Black Lives Matter and Michael Brown. And so this is when thousands of people end up driving, flying, you name it, finding a way to go and protest in Ferguson. And that is when people started thinking of Black Lives Matter as actually something that people were doing on the ground and not necessarily out in cyberspace. So clearly this is super, super controversial. No one knows that more than I do, right? So of course I got death threats for writing a book for 6th to 12th graders. If I thought it through, I might have, reconsidered. 55% of Americans were oppositional to Black Lives Matter when it came on the scene. What I grew to learn, however, is that the March on Washington, when it happened, was even more controversial, and I did not realize that. So there is a woman in town, her name is Dr. Josie Johnson, she's 88 years old, and she actually was at the March on Washington. And when she told me how hostile the response was, it wasn't that I didn't believe her, but I wanted to find some data to support it. So Gallup polls indicate that 60% of the country was oppositional to the March on Washington. And even biographers of John F. Kennedy will admit now that he was oppositional to the March on Washington. And that's not how it was taught when I was in high school. And so when you had young college students who were doing peaceful protests, and this is a lunch counter when Walgreens in the South were still segregated, and people are discouraging them from trying to eat at the lunch counter, you'll see on the slide here that 61% of Americans were against the students at the lunch counter, and 50% of Americans thought that these kind of protests were anti-American. So the racial divide in the 60s is clear, that only 36% of white Americans actually supported Martin Luther King when he was doing his work. And in fact, his popularity had diminished considerably before he was killed because he spoke out about both poverty and Vietnam. And LBJ's administration did not appreciate that. So if we connect this to Minnesota, we have had a long, long 5 years. If we take it back to the shooting of Jamar Clark, which was in North Minneapolis, it was actually this time 5 years ago when this happened. He was called in on an alleged domestic. The police came, he ended up dying, and the officers did not face disciplinary charges. This led to the taking over of the 4th precinct. The racial divide then, of course, was that Black Lives Matter was problematic. Public opinion, however, starts to shift, at least here locally, the following summer. And one of the reasons why public opinion starts to shift is because Philando Castile is killed in Falcon Heights. So Dayton is the governor at the time. As you all know, he was a second-term governor, and he made the very controversial statement that he doubted that Castile would have been shot if he'd been white. A lot of people did not like that statement. In fact, some people asked him to retract it, and he refused. However, what was different about Philando Castile and Jamar Clark was that Philando Castile was what I would call a sympathetic victim. First of all, he worked at the J.J. Hill Montessori School, which is in a perfectly nice neighborhood where respectable people send their kids to that school. He worked in the lunchroom, and people thought favorably of him. It was very different from Jamar Clark, who, for all intents and purposes, was acting up in the hood, right? And so this ends up feeling different to people. It also was a terrible 4th of July weekend nationally. So to give you some context, July 5th, Alton Sterling is shot and killed in Baton Rouge. The next day is Philando Castile. Then a Black man named Michael Johnson goes on a shooting spree of police officers. And then the next day, the Dallas police end up killing him with a bomb. And so this is like the longest 4 days that I can remember in a while. And so, this is just building up and building up. The top image is of a protester in Baton Rouge. And then the bottom image is just to give you, in terms of the time period, that it is 2016 when Colin Kaepernick decides to take a knee, which divides the nation once again, with two different camps. One camp, saying that this is important, that he bring attention to the concept of police brutality and use his power and his visibility to do that. The other camp saying that this is not patriotic, this is anti-American and completely inappropriate. So in 2018, my publisher coerced me into writing a book on race and policing. I kind of say coerce, tongue in cheek, because this is, challenging work. But I thought it was important because there isn't a lot of information out there about policing for young people. And so I wanted to be able to give students a way to think about the public policy issues that go along with policing, such as housing discrimination, white flight, and urban decay. So I have to take the students back to the 80s and 90s because even though I lived through that time period, they have not. And so it's important for them to realize what the war on drugs was, how crack ends up being in inner city neighborhoods, and what the sentencing discrepancies are between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, and how that ends up impacting Black communities, so much so that men are detained and it impacts Black families. And so, what you have is, these notions of stop and frisk. And the data shows that Black people are 5 times more likely to be arrested for drug offenses. And that Black people make up 40% of all drug-related arrests, even though Black people have 12% of the population. The way this impacts families is that you end up then sometimes having families that don't have fathers or brothers or uncles, and that's a problem. It's also a problem that in many states, once you get involved in the criminal justice system, you lose your right to vote. So what is the purpose of the police? The police are supposed to serve and protect. And so, most people want some level of service and protection. It makes all the sense in the world. The thing about it is that policing is actually complicated, right? Police fall under federal guidelines, there's statewide guidelines, there's local controls. The training is different depending on, what kind of division you go into. And then there's questions about how much training there is for firearms, how much cultural diversity training. There isn't a lot of symmetry for this in terms of how neighborhoods look differently, right? And how there might be more need for diversity training in some spaces than others. So this ends up making people who are antagonistic about the police concerned if the police are policed. And so police are subjected to internal review, but there are always all the questions about if they are disciplined or not. There's two sides of the story, right? any police officer of any racial background would say this has to be one of the toughest jobs in the nation. It's highly stressful. You don't get a lot of time to think about what your response will be. And it's one of the few professions that can literally be life or death. Um, of course, the other side of that is who ends up on the death side more often than the life side. Stop and frisk is something else that disproportionately impacts men of color. It was ruled unconstitutional by a judge in New York in 2013, but the US Court of Appeals overruled it. So we still have stop and frisk. So, I want to, try to provide everybody's argument to this story. And so for people who champion the notion of Black Lives Matter, for every person that says that, there's going to be someone else that says Blue Lives Matter. The people who are saying Blue Lives Matter are saying, listen, how can you take down the reputation of an entire profession by a few people that are not doing the right thing? Clearly, the majority of the profession has to be doing the right thing. So there's that argument. The other argument that people make is, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Black on Black crime has to be more of a problem than policing. And why isn't anybody talking about that? So where are we today, right? Because this is a hot topic and it moves every minute. And so where we are today is that, sadly enough, Memorial Weekend, we get George Floyd. Everyone on the call is familiar with what happened this past summer with George Floyd. For me, some of the surprising things that have happened after George Floyd are the responses. Because when I think back to 2012, when Black Lives Matter was starting, people of different races and different political spectrum were really not excited about Black Lives Matter. And so a perfect example is if you think about the 2016 election, when Hillary Rodham Clinton was running on the Democratic Party, she had to be incredibly persuaded to get the Mothers of the Movement, which was an organization that represents mothers whose sons have been killed by police, to come up on the stage during the Democratic National Convention. She did not want to do that, but her advisors felt that she had to make that effort. What is fascinating, though, is that if you fast forward to June of 2020, you have Mitt Romney, who is a Republican senator who ended up going out in a rally. And of course, he has his mask on because it's COVID. And he ends up tweeting Black Lives Matter. Now, the first time I saw this, I was convinced that this was like not true and like a meme that someone made. And so, of course, I went into Twitter and realized that this is actually his Twitter account. And so to see the vast change that has happened in the last 6 years really gives an indication about how much public opinion has moved. And so I'm going to just start to wrap up here and say, part of what has made the conversation interesting is that now it has become incredibly global. So this is an image from London, where people are protesting George Floyd. This is in front of a statue of Winston Churchill. And also, I don't know if people on the call realize that there are Black Lives Matter chapters all over the world. In fact, one of the leaders of the Toronto chapter came to the Twin Cities and met some people. So I will close out with that. I really appreciate people's willingness to, engage me on something like this on a Thursday evening. I will stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take questions.
Okay, so if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and then I'll share some of those questions with Professor Harris. Was a lot of information, so you must have questions.
Yeah, and I know that was like a semester's class in like 30 minutes, so I apologize for that. But don't be shy. No one's getting a grade. or I should say A is for everyone.
I have a question, so I'll start. So it's interesting. I'm trying to see where I put it in my notes, where you talked about how the March on Washington, and how when you were taught about this in school, you weren't taught that like 50% of white people thought Martin Luther King Jr. was harming the movement. And I would say the same thing, that I was taught a different story, and I think we're still kind of taught a different story today, of that like everyone loved Martin Luther King Jr. and thought he was fantastic, and what he was doing was supported by everyone. Why do you think that we have this distorted story that we've all been told and we're continually told?
You know, I really appreciate that question. So my first book started off with the Kennedy administration. And so if you go to the Kennedy Library in Boston, or if you go to the Schlesinger Library, you know, and you work with the archival data, we're not a nation that has a lot of critique of our presidents, right? We tend to revere our presidents. And so Kennedy and King end up going hand in hand as being heroes of the 60s. And it's partly because as a nation, like we like those kinds of stories. What's interesting though, as I said, because we have people who are still alive who remember it, and also because you can go back into like the microfilm and get, you know, the newspaper articles. Um, you know, King wasn't that popular toward the end because King came from a privileged class background. If you went to visit his home in Atlanta, that's a museum now, you'd realize he had wallpaper on the wall. You know, he was second generation college educated, and this was a Black person born in the 1920s. So he didn't know a lot about urban poverty. When he went to Chicago, urban Black people in Chicago booed him because they were like, you don't even understand us. When he started tapping into like a poverty argument, people didn't like that. And when he spoke out against Vietnam, people didn't like that. And so that's just a story that is not popular to tell. A lot of publishers wouldn't want to tell that story. And because we revere JFK, it's not really a story that people want to tell, that he didn't want the March on Washington to happen. The truth of the matter is the March on Washington was supposed to happen in 1942, but we were still in World War II, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt brokered a deal with a union organizer named A. Philip Randolph. And he told A. Philip Randolph, if you don't have your march for jobs and freedom and come to DC when I'm in the midst of fighting this global war, I will sign Executive Order 8802. Executive Order 8802 desegregated federal jobs. And that meant that Black people could work for the federal government. So the March on Washington had been in the works for 2 decades before 63. And the last thing I'll say about that is people often, I try to ask my students, do you know why it didn't happen in 62 or 64? Kind of like a trick question. And they never know the answer. The reason why it happened in 63 is because it was the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Thank you. All right, we have lots of questions now in the chat. I'll start with the first one. How has the feedback been from teachers who use the book when they finally had the actual copies of it?
Right. You know, what is been interesting is which teachers have been allowed to use the book, right? Because you know, there's certain schools that didn't want the book used. When the book has ever been used, all the feedback that I've gotten is a sense of relief. And the reason why I say a sense of relief is that it connects to this next question about what conversation starters are. Because the book has ways for students to talk about this, and we really don't have a good language. We don't have a good way of talking about difficult subjects with young people. And so once teachers have used it, they're like, wow, I'm kind of glad I did that because I didn't have a tool.
Nice. Do you have any other conversation starters for the community?
I mean, sure. I mean, so what I do now, like this was my first book with Abdo. And so now I actually have more than 100. And what I do in these books is like we usually have, discussion questions and projects, and all, different activities that students can do, just to talk about difference, right? I mean, because that's really what a lot of this is about, is just difference and history.
Okay. Where do you see this movement in 5 years?
That's a good question. Um, I'm humbled by the fact that, I'm in my 50s. And so I'm not sure what the younger generation plans to do since they have such different tools than my generation did. And so on Saturday, I'm going to conduct an online discussion with Josie Johnson, the woman I mentioned who's 88, and then Anika Bowie, who I think is 28 or 29, and will be heading up the Minneapolis NAACP. And we'll be talking about how the strategies are different. And so I think in the midst of COVID, the way movements unfold is very different, and the fact that people do things now in Twitterverse, in a way that when I was in my 20s that didn't exist. And so, I'm really not sure. The only thing I can say concretely that I've seen that's happened is the election of Cori Bush to Congress in Missouri. And Cori Bush is a nurse, and she was one of the on the scene people helping out with people who were injured during Ferguson. And then she ended up becoming injured herself. And she was very upset about that. And she decided to run for Congress and win, going into Congress in a very untraditional way. It's been shown online that she's buying her clothing for Congress at thrift stores, because that's the class background that she's from. And so some people are taking the movement to electoral politics, but I really don't know what's next.
The next question is, you kind of talked about this with your comments about like Twitter, the invention of Twitter, but why is it that the Black Lives Movement didn't blow up until not that long ago? And then the follow-up question to this is, why is it not taught in schools? So you talked about how some schools are not allowed to teach your book.
Yeah.
So maybe address that a little bit more.
Sure. I would say why it took so long partly is that I teach a class called the Obama Presidency, and one of the things I do in the class is talk about the what I would say over expectations that many Black Americans had for Obama. And so I don't think that people expected Obama to be a president, right? And presidents aren't activists. So when Reagan, Bush, and Clinton weren't responding to Black social justice movements, that was expected. When Obama didn't respond, I think that made younger Black people angry. So for instance, just so you know, Black Lives Matter wanted to meet with Obama, and he had his aide, Valerie Jarrett, meet with them. But he never met with Black Lives Matter like in 8 years. And so I think that's partly why that happened, that Black people thought that they would feel more safe. And when they didn't, it was out of frustration. Um, Responding to people not teaching my books. So when I did my tour 4 years ago for my publisher, I took 18 trips. 7 were to Texas. I never talked about my book anywhere in Texas. And as you know, Texas is a large state. And even in Houston, I didn't talk about the book. And so come to find out, the school board is appointed by the governor, and their curriculum is just not responsive to this kind of material.
This is a question that follows that up nicely because it's about publishing. Since publishers only publish what sells, how do we make sure all stories are told?
That's tough. I mean, I love my publisher. I've been with them now more than 5 years. But, I'll make a pitch, and, the final answer comes from the marketing salespeople. right? I mean, that's the final answer. So I have all these like intellectually like, oh, isn't this fascinating? And they're like, we don't know if that's going to sell. Um, and so that's just the dilemma. I mean, I'm really pleased they allowed me to do a book on Blacks in Paris. Like a lot of people don't realize that African Americans have been expatriates to France ever since World War One, and they're Black American communities in Paris. But it took me 2 years to sell them on that. When I first pitched it, they were like, stop the pitch. But what's funny is when it came out, School Library Journal was like, can you write an essay about this book? And can you talk about this book? And so it ended up doing better than I think they thought it would. But if it, this is America. If it's not going to be a profit, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. What is a question most people don't ask, but it should be a question that is asked?
This summer, I would have liked some people to ask me why I feel the way I feel. And the reason why I say that is that I had some white colleagues that were really devastated by George Floyd, and they could tell that I was upset, but I mean, I wasn't devastated. And I realized that they just did not understand that it didn't feel very different to me from Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, or like, any other incident that had happened. I think that this felt differently to a lot of people because we were quarantined. The video was vivid. I think it was shared on Instagram 20 million times, like on the first day. And so it was there and people could sit with it. But for some people, I know it was the first time they were sitting with something like this. And for me, like, I've sat with this my whole life. But they didn't ask me why it didn't feel the way to me that I think they thought I should feel.
Thank you. So I'm going to read this one word for word. It says, hearing your recollection of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I recall being taught that Malcolm X was extremely radical and nearly terroristic. Looking back now with the information that I have about him and his movement, I was terrified how indoctrination was alive and well, even in my education in the 90s. How do you think his tactics for protests and addressing issues compared to the leaders of Black Lives Matter now?
That is an excellent question. And so a biography of Malcolm X just won a national book award yesterday. I think you guys are book people. You probably, but and a book for young people. I just saw that because the award ceremonies were online yesterday. So people are starting to rethink Malcolm X. His strategies were actually very different because Malcolm X was more about Black people lifting themselves up. And so Malcolm X never bothered with, protesting like anything, actually. Like that was not his thing. Like he wasn't someone that was like, let's gather up and let's have a rally. Like that wasn't his thing. He wanted Black people to buy from each other, to educate each other, and basically kind of keep to themselves. But you never saw him taking to the streets.
Okay. So what would you say to a teacher who tells you that their administration won't allow the use of any Black Lives Matter like materials or posters in the classroom because it is politically charged?
I have to admit, I'm not very good with that, and I was sharing that with, in our earlier conversation before this started, because, for 26 years, I've worked somewhere where we have the privilege to do what we want to do. And so, K through 12 teachers are in the dilemma that if the administration tells you not to do it, then you can get fired. And so, I mean, I'm not going to suggest that anyone do something that could get you fired. And so I think it's a dilemma. I don't know how to address that because I mean, I wouldn't say, fight the system, teach my book, then you're going to like look me up and ask me to like buy your groceries or something. So I'm sorry.
Okay. Here's a question from a high school student. What are the next steps for students as we go forward, especially white students who are not directly feeling the effects of racism or police brutality?
I think just reading about it and understanding it, right? Because I mean, I think of, there are things that people who are not directly connected to them and who can benefit from knowing the story. And I just think, for instance, like when I learned about the Holocaust, I have no descendants who are Jewish, right? I have no one that was persecuted in the Holocaust. But I feel like learning about the Holocaust made me understand my Jewish colleagues better and maybe understand world history better.
That's a really good answer. Did you hear that, everybody? Read. Okay, here's another question. This is a long one. This is a sensitive topic. Sometimes it feels impossible to talk about with police because acknowledging the challenges of the policing profession seems to require admitting mistakes, which is hard to do. It seems that police aren't even allowed to acknowledge that. So it creates a very uncomfortable divide. Expressing concerns about policing seems unacceptable, but if we and they can't talk about it, how can this reality improve?
I mean, as I opened up, I mean, this is incredibly delicate, and just so I'm clear, I'm not anti-police. If someone broke into my house, I would hope that like the person was caught and that my stuff would be returned. So I'm not anti-police. What I'm in favor of is looking at the nuances of how all of this happens. So for instance, the mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter III, his dad, Melvin Carter Jr., was recently retired. He was a police officer for more than 30 years. He said that he was more afraid when he was out of uniform than when he was in uniform, because when he was out of uniform, he was just like a black guy walking down the street. And so there just need to be conversations about the fact that black men couldn't become police officers until the 1940s. When they became police officers, they were originally only allowed to police in black neighborhoods. And then I think one of the things that hurts, um, emotionally hurts people in communities of color is that the police can live elsewhere and then they can come in and police. So a perfect example is, in Minneapolis, to be on city council, you have to live in Minneapolis. To be the mayor, you have to live in Minneapolis. As we know, the chief of police lives in Hugo, which is near where I live. I live in Venice Heights, right? Hugo is profoundly more safe and a much more lovely place to live than much of Minneapolis, um, which is true about where I live. And so I think that part of it is like, we have to talk about this or it's not going to get better.
Okay, so this question follows that one nicely. We have to talk about it. So how can we get issues like racism and police brutality be talked about and cared about more in our primarily white community where most people aren't affected by these issues?
I mean, if it weren't COVID, I would say guest speakers. And the reason why I say that is because there are so many topics that we talk about in classrooms, controversial or not, that just don't seem real to students, right? I mean, I get that. Because the students I have, are only a year older than those of you all who are teaching high school. And so I think that it's like the interacting with people is what can make people have more empathy or compassion or even just interest. Sometimes it's not that students aren't empathetic, it's just that they're bored. Like I have 3 kids, 2 of them are teenagers, like they're like on TikTok. So I mean, I can't get them interested in anything that isn't in the refrigerator. So I mean, it's just a challenge overall.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Does anyone have another question they want to type in the chat? I think I hit all of them.
And just so you know, what I put in the chat, because the French teacher was like, what is the
Yep.
book? So
Mhm.
that is the link to
Mhm.
my collection. And it was just this week that they put the images up for the new books, which can be pre-ordered now. I don't think people will be able to get them until January. But that's the entire set. And it also makes the distinction between what's 4th to 8th grade and what's 6th to 12th grade as well.
And I was telling Duchess before you all came in the call that on that link, I was listening to her podcast, that she had some podcasts that she recorded with her son. It's a really fun exchange between her and her son. You should listen to those as well. Follow the link and you can
It
listen.
is hilarious. And just for those of you all who are asking, how can I translate this to white students? My husband's Black, so, we have this Black child, and I am telling you, he was like, I don't like Motown because it's not Panic of the Disco, right? So I mean, his connection to, I was like, let's talk about Mom's Motown book. He's like, no, it sounds old, it sounds boring. Then when I tried to explain to him who Diana Ross was, and I said, oh, have you seen that show Blackish? That's Rainbow's mom in real life. And his first response was, she has to be really old because Rainbow's old. So, everybody's learning, right? And that's the other thing. So even if you have Black students, that doesn't mean that they have some of the historical context for this.
Any other questions? If anybody wants to post? So what we can do, thrive in Hastings, is when Professor Harris leaves, she has another engagement again tonight, another presentation or Zoom something she's doing tonight. She's a busy lady. We can stay on and have a community conversation. Those of you who want to stay on and talk about this issue some more, talk about what we learned. You're welcome to do that. But thank you so much, Professor Harris.
It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your attention, to these things, and do have me back.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye.